Okay, let's unpack this moment. Imagine this, a White House hallway. The air is probably still thick, right? After what we understand were some incredibly tense trade talks between Canada and the US. Yeah, really high-stakes stuff. And then Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, apparently just unloads a string of insults aimed right at the Canadian people, but delivered, straight at Prime Minister Mark Carney right there in that formal setting. It's quite something. It really screams power imbalance, maybe. And it gets personal incredibly fast. What strikes me straight away is that contrast, the setting versus the outburst itself. That kind of personal attack seemingly delivered with real disdain inside the symbolic heart of the White House. It really makes you think about the other dynamics underneath it all. Exactly. So, for this deep dive, we've gathered accounts, mostly text descriptions, it seems, detailing this specific confrontation between Leavitt and Prime Minister Carney. Our goal today is really to dissect these key moments to try and understand what they tell us about, Canada's strength, its national spirit maybe, and fundamentally what actually happened in that hallway. And keeping you, our listener, in mind, someone who values getting the essentials quickly, but also thoroughly, we want to offer those key insights, those aha moments hopefully without getting bogged down in, every tiny detail. Right. We're really aiming for a clear understanding of this significant exchange and what it truly signifies. Okay, so let's paint the picture, a White House hallway. And these aren't just, regular office quarters. No, definitely not. The sources describe this long, impressive space, polished marble floors reflecting chandeliers, historic portraits looking down. It's a place heavy with symbolism, with history. Absolutely solemn, you might say, and there stands Prime Minister Carney, sharp navy suit, apparently surrounded by his delegation, Canadian officials. You can almost feel the tension still hanging there after those tough talks with President Trump. That grandeur, the location, it's key, isn't it? It really underscores the gravity of international diplomacy. Yeah, so, for such a personal, and heated exchange to happen right there, it's quite remarkable the image of Carney and his team all formal. It just clashes so sharply with the other verbal aggression described. Then reportedly Leavitt strides in the click of her heels echoing. That's a detail the sources mention. Sets the scene. Yeah, no subtlety. It seems straight for Carney. A smug look on her face is how it's described. Apparently put out he hadn't greeted her. Oh, interesting detail. And in the opening shot, Prime Minister Carney, she calls out loud enough for everyone. That meeting with President Trump was a disaster, wasn't it? Word is Kennedy got nothing. Some negotiator you turned out to be. Wow, straight in. That's a direct hit. Right. You can almost feel the other collective sharp intake of breath from the Canadians. That initial comment, it's clearly meant to wound, isn't it? To publicly undermine Carney and by extension, Canada's position. Yeah, that world-class negotiator bit sounds laced with sarcasm, totally. And what's interesting is how fast Leavitt frames what were likely very complex trade talks in such a personal and dismissive way. But Carney apparently keeps his cool. The sources really highlight his calm yet firm reply. He makes the point that negotiations are a long game, he says, not a performance. Good line. And then he gets a subtle jab back at Leavitt, referencing her own press briefings and having to manage presidential social media outbursts. Turning it back slightly, you can sort of sense how his background, leading the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, it lends a certain weight to that measured tone precisely. He seems to avoid getting dragged into just an emotional shouting match. His response feels calculated? Yeah, having to guard just to tough the least and close bone. By mentioning his own experience, maybe even hinting at challenges on the U.S. side, he's trying to regain some control of the narrative, I think, without stooping to her level. But Leavitt apparently doesn't back down. She escalates, calls him a banker playing dress-up in politics, ouch, and claims Canada's quaking in its boots before President Trump. The sources really emphasize the contempt in her voice, trying to paint a picture of weakness. But Carney fires back, saying, politics ain't about who can shout the loudest. He even brings up leading Canada through the 2008 financial crisis, drawing on history. And a quote from his 2023 Davos speech, "Vision and dreaming. It's knowing your destination." It's like he's trying to remind her and everyone else there of his track record. That mention of 2008 is significant, isn't it? He's using a past example of well-effective leadership under serious pressure to directly counter her claims of Canadian weakness. Right, and the Davos quote, it adds this layer of thoughtful strategy to his response. Suggests a more considerate approach than just reacting emotionally. Then comes the really inflammatory part. Leavitt reportedly calls Canadians freeloaders. Wow, clinging to American traits, she says, and claims Canada would crumble without the U.S. Okay, that's a huge escalation. The sources describe it like a punch to the gut, a direct assault on the whole country. Yeah, that's not just about Carney anymore. Apparently, the Canadian officials are visibly shocked. And for a moment, Carney himself reportedly just freezes. The text describes his hand clenching into a fist. You can feel the tension ratcheting up before he turns. Eyes narrowed, it says, and tells Leavitt she has crossed a line, and that feels like a critical shift. Moving from insults about Carney to these broad honestic insults, that's a major step. Definitely. It probably solidified the Canadian delegation's unity and maybe even strengthened Karen's position as the defender of Canada's honor. That physical reaction, the fist, hints at the emotion, right, but it's his controlled words that seem to carry the weight. Exactly, and his reply is forceful. Defends Canada as a sovereign nation. Diverse economy spanning clean energy to advanced technology, he says, and a spirit of unity that he suggests Leavitt just doesn't get. Drawing a clear line, he states, we don't cling, we stand on our own. Defeat, right. He directly pushes back on her main accusations and appeals to that strong sense of national pride. Self-reliance. Yeah, and by specifically naming those key sectors, clean energy, techs, he's directly challenging the whole freeloader idea with, concrete examples of Canadian strength. Leavitt tries to brush off, apparently brings up President Trump's 25% tariffs, claims Canada is too spineless to retaliate. The tariff argument, but Carney flips it. Argues that hiding behind tariffs is itself a kind of spinelessness. Interesting term. He circles back to Canada's experience in the 2008 crisis. Again, stressing his role guiding the central bank through that, says something like, if you believe tariffs will break U.S., look at our history. Canada has weathered far worse and emerged stronger. He really turns that argument around effectively. Instead of Canada being weak and vulnerable to tariffs, he implies that relying on tariffs shows a lack of maybe stronger strategies on the U.S. side. Yeah, and bringing up 2008 again provides that powerful historical evidence of Canadian economic resilience when things got really tough globally. Then there's this intriguing moment. Carney's aide steps forward, hands him a shoulder. Oh, a prop. Seems like it. Suddenly his demeanor shifts, becomes more confident. He starts talking about Canada actively diversifying trade. Europe, Asia, right, moving beyond just the U.S. focus. Mentions rising exports to the EU. Canada's leadership in clean energy tech, even names Shopify, putting specifics out there. Leavitt just scoffs, apparently calls it a pipe dream. Dismissive, but that folder, it works as a great visual, doesn't it? Symbol. Yeah, it represents tangible proof against her dismissals. By highlighting Canada, broadening its horizons, the success of Canadian companies in new areas, Carney paints this picture of a dynamic, adaptable economy. not just dependent on the US. Leavitt then tries again to diminish Canada's economy, calls it a one-trick pony. Timber and maple syrup. She apparently says previously, timber and maple syrup. Yeah, the sources say the Canadian officials actually had trouble not laughing. I can believe it, that's quite outdated. And Carney's response is described as wonderfully ironic. He just calmly repeats Canada's leadership in clean energy tech, the global reach of companies like Shopify, Canada's role in the G7 pushing for fair trade and green tech. It sounds like a major miscalculation on Leavitt's part really reveals a lack of current understanding of Canada's economy. Totally. And it gives Carney a perfect opening to highlight Canada's actual modern strengths on the world stage, directly undermining her attempt to paint it as, insignificant. Next, Leavitt pivots back to personal attacks on Carney, no real politician, amateur banker, doubling down on the personal references, the chaos in Parliament, the fragility of his minority government, which the sources remind us started in April 2025, trying to exploit perceived political weakness. But Carney's response focuses on ideas, national unity, is simply measured by the number of seats in Parliament, he says, but by the collective will of a nation. And again, he invokes Canada's history of overcoming challenges. That's quite skillful, actually. Redirecting from potential political vulnerability, a minority government can be tricky towards this deeper sense of shared identity and history. Right. It's a strategic move, reframing it from political weakness to inherent national strength. And then, just as Leavitt looks ready to, keep going, a U.S. official interrupts, says she's needed back in the briefing room. An interruption. Timing is everything. Totally cuts off her momentum, and Carney jumps on the chance. Reiterates that diplomacy negotiations, they're about building a future together, not getting lost in petty squabbles. That interruption is a huge turning point, isn't it? It stops her attack cold. Yeah, and it lets Carney regain control, frame himself as the more mature, strategically focused one by talking about the future, not petty squabbles. Carney then delivers this really powerful closing statement, asserts Canada's vital role NATO cornerstone G7 leader key link in global supply chains, especially again, clean energy and advanced tech, broadening the scope beyond just trade, and he delivers this line, we are not a dependent nation, we are an indispensable partner. Indispensable strong word choice directly refutes Leavitt's earlier claim that Canada needs the youngest and more. He really underscores the need for mutual respect in the partnership. That statement really pulls it all together. He's not just talking economics. He's hitting Canada's strategic importance globally. Yeah, and indispensable is such a deliberate pushback against her whole attempt to diminish Canada's significance, highlights the mutual benefit. He wraps up with this really strong message about the unbreakable spirit of Canadians, their history of overcoming adversity, their readiness to negotiate as equals, but without, bowing to insults. He states firmly, Canada is prepared to negotiate as equals, but we will never yield to insults or intimidation. That is the Canadian way. Powerful ending. The sources suggest Leavitt looked pretty shaken by this resolute stance, while Carney remained, unflappable. That final statement, it feels crafted to resonate deeply back home in Canada, right? Taps into national pride, reinforces those core values of standing firm under pressure. It's a memorable way to end the confrontation and the aftermath. What happened next? Well, reports indicate reporters quickly swarmed the hallway. Carney gave a brief statement, something about defending Canada's honor, and Leavitt apparently slipped away pretty unnoticed, and predictably, Canadian news outlets jumped all over it. Lots of praise for Carney's defense. Headlines like, Lonely Leavitt started trending online. Lonely Leavitt, huh? Captures the mood, I guess. Yeah, it definitely captures the public perception that she kind of came out of that exchange isolated and maybe discredited. So the key takeaway then from digging into this, It seems this very personal clash right there in the White House ended up highlighting Canadian unity, maybe resilience, national pride, facing down some pretty aggressive attacks and economic pressure. Absolutely. And as you've listened to this unfold, it's worth considering perhaps how this story reflects that basic importance of national identity, of standing firm on your values. Was there a particular moment or line in that exchange that really stood out to you? Yeah, good question. And maybe one final thought to leave you with. Given Canada's demonstrated resolve here, what future challenges might actually test this unbreakable spirit they talk about? And how might this very public, very tense encounter shape Canada's relationship with the U.S. moving forward? Something to mull